Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Mike Petrilli. I'm the Executive Vice President at the Thomas B. Fordham Institute. For those of you who haven't been here before, welcome, and those of you tuning in for the first time, welcome. We are an education policy think tank based here in Washington, D.C. We also do on-the-ground work in Ohio, and we're thrilled to be co-hosting this event with Teach Plus. It is so easy in Washington, D.C., and particularly at a think tank, to get cut off from the real world, you might imagine, and especially the real world of what's happening in classrooms and in real schools. And so anytime we have an opportunity to hear directly from teachers who are in there doing the work that is so critically important and giving us feedback on how it's going so that those of us that think about policy and might have some influence over policy can do our jobs better, it's such a great opportunity. We are lucky at Fordham because we do on-the-ground work in Ohio. We actually authorize about 10 charter schools, so we have colleagues who are in the schools every day as well and are trying to make good things happen for kids. But this is something that we just can't ever hear enough from teachers that are doing the work, and so we're so thrilled to be a part of this. So just to welcome you, you'll see me again in about an hour when I moderate the policy panel. But first, let me introduce to you Celine Coggins, who heads Teach Plus. Celine, come on up.
Hi there, thank you all for coming, and thank you all in the online community. We're really excited to be here at Fordham, and thanks, Mike. I founded Teach Plus about 5 years ago. We're a teacher leadership organization. Our theory of change is really that to change the profession and change outcomes for kids, we need teachers to be leaders both on the ground in schools as well as in changing policy. We work with about 700 teachers around the country in 2 leadership programs. The first is our Teaching Policy Fellows program. This is an opportunity for teachers to really dig into policy and advocacy issues that exist both in their communities and nationally. As well as we have our T3 Turnaround Teacher Teams program, which is an opportunity for teachers in select communities to work in schools that are low performing as teams supporting the development of their peers. We also have a network of about 15,000 teachers around the country where we offer opportunities to participate in events, in Common Core training, in writing op-eds, and in social media. Before I go any further, I want to thank Mark Teo, who's our research director at Teach Plus. He led this work. And I want to thank Tammy Hiller, who is our former network coordinator in Los Angeles, who was an important research assistant on the work. So our work in policy serves to create brokering opportunities between teachers and policymakers. When we talk about the work, we often talk about helping teachers to become bilingual and speak the language not just of practice, but also of policy. So this work on testing grew out of an incredibly complex experience we were seeing on the ground in our 6 cities around the country. In each of our cities, there was a frustration that this really serious, complex issue was getting distilled down to a largely rhetorical debate about whether there's too much testing. What we saw with teachers is something that was much more complex and nuanced. So much of our work involves asking the question, where can the voice of teachers influence the direction of decision-making that affects classrooms, but tends to be made far from classrooms? We ask teachers, what do policymakers need to know? And so I want to talk about this research report and set it in context. It's our second big piece of work on testing, and it evolved from the first. The first thing teachers said when we asked what policymakers need to know about testing is that not all tests are created equal. It was a quality issue first, not necessarily a quantity issue. What they talked about was a need to get more worthwhile tests and fewer of the tests that weren't working for them. And I'll give one example that I saw around the country. When we worked with groups of 25 or so teachers, we'd hear one teacher toward the conclusion of the school year say, I just gave the 3rd of our formative assessments. I got the data back right away because the assessment was online. The kids knew they had made more than a year's worth of growth. I was really excited. They were excited. We were crying together. And it was assessment that helped to guide everything that happened in my classroom that year. And oftentimes, you'd see 20 some odd other teachers in the room say, oh my goodness, I have nothing like that. I just have a state test that I give in March, get back the results from the next fall, and I can never do anything to improve my instruction. And so what we did first was we worked with a small group of teachers to build a Yelp-like website where teachers could rate the quality of hundreds of different assessments. And we worked with the NEA to get it out to millions of teachers around the country. It was fascinating. Teachers were able to rank the assessments they gave on 0 to 5 stars, and we were able to develop an agenda that helped to articulate what teachers are looking for in tests. Quite simply, number 1, they need to be aligned to standards. Number 2, capture the learning of students far above and far below grade level. 3, ask complex questions. 4, return data quickly. And 5, connect to the resources that help teachers improve. So that was a really important kind of piece of work by teachers around the country. But it only answered one question. It started to answer a quality question. And these questions about the quantity of tests still persisted. And so we sought to say, okay, so this has to be an interplay. We have to look at both quality and quantity. Let's ask the question, how much testing is happening in American classrooms? And so I want to talk very briefly about our methodology. And I was supposed to have a clicker, and I don't have a clicker. Is there a way to advance the slides? All right, go ahead. So I have a couple of questions, sorry, to frame this and ask of you all first. So just to give kind of a gauge, let's start by asking how much time is typically spent on state and district mandated testing in urban districts across the US. So you all have the opportunity to weigh in, and this will be kind of a guide for our conversation going forward. So the first answer is between 31 and 40%. Second is between 11 and 20%. Third is between 2 and 10%. And the fourth is less than 2%. State and district testing. Okay, so we have no answers at between 31 and 40. Between 11 and 20, 39% of the room. So that was the plurality of the room. Between 2 and 10%, we have 29%, and then less than 2, 32%. So that just gives a gauge of, folks who are fairly well informed in this room are thinking about how much testing goes on. One more. Within the study that we're putting forward, take a guess at how much more testing time is spent in places that are doing the highest amount of testing relative to the lowest amount of testing. So is it 2 times more? Is it 3 times, 4 times, 5 times, or 6 times? So answers kind of all over the map. The largest groups were 3 times more and 5 times more, but we saw a little bit of everything. All right, so that's going to be a frame for some of our findings going forward, just to give you a sense of kind of where people in the room were. All right, so the key questions that we asked in this study were the 4 that are up there. Number 1, how much time do students spend on state and district mandated tests in ELA and math at 3 key grade levels? We looked at kindergarten, 3rd grade, and 7th grade. Number 2 is how does test time vary across 12 major urban districts in America? 3rd is how does test time vary between urban districts and the suburban districts that surround them? And then what is the gap between teacher reports of test administration time and then how district calendars report test administration time, and what explains this discrepancy? I want to talk a little bit about the methodology. Thanks. So we studied 32 districts, 12 urban and 20 suburban. This started out as an attempt to gain a better understanding of what was happening in the 6 districts in which we work. So those were the focal districts of this study. And then we had 6 urban comparison districts that we looked at that were geographically representative. For each focal district, we also looked at 3 or 4 surrounding suburban communities and compared test time in the urban district to the suburban. And then when we also, in our focal districts, looked at teacher reports of administration time. And so we had 300 teachers who were spread across those grade levels that we studied. A few notes. This is just state and district mandated tests. There are a whole array of teacher developed tests that happen that we did not study. We only looked at ELA and math, so there are certain other assessments that go on in schools that we did not study, and we only looked at grades K, 3, and 7. So I want to kind of flip back now to the key findings. So these are some of the key findings from the report. Across the 12 urban districts, the average amount of time that students spend on state tests in grades 3 and 7 equals 1.7% of the school year, and substantially less in kindergarten. Second, the variation in test time across urban districts is large, with high test districts spending as much as 5 times as much time on testing as in low test districts. Third, urban districts spend on average more time than their suburban counterparts on testing. Suburban districts in this study average less than 1.3% of the school year on testing. And then number 4, teachers calculate test administration time to be more than double the length that district calendars reported in elementary grades. So I want to go deeper on some of those findings. So this graphic looks at the amount of test time. If you look at what you see here is first kindergarten, where there's about 3.1 hours of testing on average in our districts. Then you move to 3rd grade, and this looks at the green is ELA and the blue is math. Combined, those equal out to about 16.3 hours in 3rd grade, and about 16.9 hours in 7th grade. If you look at kindergarten, if you look at a place like Shelby County, Tennessee, which is where Memphis is, they require no assessments at the district or at the state level for kindergartners. That's in large contrast to a place like Atlanta that requires both state and district testing that totals about 10 hours a year for kindergartners. If you move on to 3rd grade, what you see is in Chicago, where they've just made a whole bunch of their formerly district mandated assessments optional. They now, at the 3rd grade level, only have about 5.1 hours of testing as compared to 25 in Cleveland. If you look at 7th, Chicago again comes in at the lowest at 5.1 hours as compared to 25 in Houston. If you look at how this cumulatively adds up from kindergarten to 8th grade, about a difference of 120 hours when you look at a high test district that tests about 160 hours over that period of time to a low test that's only testing about 40 hours during that period of time. Next question is urban versus suburban. As you see in the very early grades, kindergarten and grade 1, there's actually less testing that's required in urban districts, and then that goes up markedly for the kind of mandated testing grades. If we move on to the next one, this talks about the gap between teacher report and what's reported in district calendars. This is the one that has made me very popular among the moms in my daughter's 3rd grade class. So just kind of how can we think about testing beyond what is reported in a district calendar? What we find is that inexperienced test takers like kindergartners take much longer to just the simple act of administering the test takes much longer. It's 3 times more teachers at the kindergarten level report. Teachers at the 3rd grade level report that it takes twice as long to administer tests as what the district calendar reports, and that really evens out substantially by 7th grade. A few points. We looked at this question of the other impacts on instructional time, and I'll leave most of this for the teachers to talk about. But there was huge variation among teachers in who were giving tests that they felt were worthwhile and related to their curriculum versus those who felt like they were giving tests that were disconnected from what they were expected to teach. So sometimes assessments were reported to be done well and be a real important part of instruction. Sometimes they talked about preparation being kind of separate and that there were burdens to administration time that needed to be taken into account. So I'll talk real briefly about some of our policy recommendations, and we can kind of go into more depth during the panel. So number 1, this gives us the opportunity to kind of shift the debate from global to local. Just like there's no typical American student, there's no typical American student experience with testing. There's actually a very wide range. There's a lot of district discretion, and there's a lot of kind of school-based and teacher discretion. Number 2, this gives us an opportunity to work with teachers to streamline testing in high test districts. For the first time, looking at these 32 districts, we have a first kind of cut at what would average be in terms of the amount of testing. There are some districts that we found who are way out of whack with what kind of average is. But beyond that, we need to focus on content beyond just time. So really thinking about our tests assessing the things that teachers tell us need to be assessed, higher order thinking skills, computation skills, those types of things. The next one is recognize that some of the test features that teachers value take time. So essays and things like that. Couple more recommendations. Number one, proceed with Common Core implementation, recognizing that long-term gain will exceed short-term pain. Right now, we've got some places that, and my daughter's school happens to be one of them, that are piloting the PARCC and Smarter Balanced assessments while they're still doing their existing state tests. That is, going to create some short-term challenges. And finally, report test time in ways that better reflect teacher reality, especially in the elementary grades. All right, so I'm going to step down and allow the teachers to engage in a conversation with Alex.
Thank you all for being here today. I want to say a special thank you to our teachers, especially Christina and Joe, who somehow managed to get out of Indianapolis despite canceled flights and bad weather. All of our teachers here today, including them and Joseph and Joy, are teaching policy fellows with Teach Plus. That means that they are teachers who have demonstrated effectiveness in the classroom, they work in high poverty schools, and they are part of our 18-month policy fellowship program where they learn about education research, policy, and advocacy, and work collectively with teachers in their community on behalf of policy changes that will benefit students in their community. And they have some really fascinating things to say. I also want to say a huge thank you to Alex Fuentes and Dwight Davis, who are two DC teachers who are with us today, who gamely offered to step in if the Indianapolis flights didn't work out, and I hope you both will participate during the Q&A. So turning to the report, our research found that schools spend less than 2% of time on state and district mandated testing, less than folks in this room expected, and less than I think a lot of people listening and watching expected. Are you surprised? And based on this evidence, what do you think the debate on testing should focus on? Christina, let's start with you.
Sure. So I think what Celine talked about with the teacher perception being higher than the actual recorded time on testing really resonated with me. I used to work in a district where we just dedicated a lot of time to test prep. We had a dedicated period every day that was just about the test. It wasn't an English class, it wasn't a math class, it was 6 tests, which is test prep. We had a lot of practice sessions, a lot of diagnostic tests just for the state test. So it definitely felt like we spent more time on it and that it took away from our instruction, even though it wasn't, just limited to that time that we were actually at the computer or the test booklet.
Joe?
In my experience, the time on the state test, actually taking the assessment is one small measure of what really occurs. In my school and in my district, we spend a tremendous amount of time preparing specifically for the test. I teach in the district, which Christina left, and we have a success period. It means success on the state test. You have teachers who are not necessarily math or English content area teachers, teaching test skills and identified high impact standards to the best of their ability for 30 minutes each and every day. So we have a dedicated period for the test. So that drastically expands the time on testing that the students spend. And in addition to that, our professional development is largely driven by how to improve student test scores, and it does not necessarily reflect improving instruction. It's test-taking strategies and marginal ways to improve scores, but does not necessarily lead to conversations around how do we better educate our kids, how do we better demonstrate mastery of standards.
Joseph?
So I actually calculated the amount of time that my students in 4th grade when I was in the classroom actually took to take the assessment. and the percentage that I got was actually double the percentage that was in the report. And so that's important for me because I think I come from a district, Los Angeles Unified, which has a lot of English language learners. And so the test would not mean anything unless the students were provided the opportunity to finish the test. And English language learners and other students, they needed the time and above the amount of minutes that was put forth in the administrative guide to complete the test. Then I could actually take that data and use it to inform my instruction. So it was a bit surprising to me.
And Joy.
The findings were consistent with previous years, but with the implementation of Common Core now, we're starting to have more time where we're implementing writing tests for 3rd grade through 11th grade. So we're having a little bit more time with prepping for our tests.
Great, thank you. So I also want to ask you, how do you see using test time in your classroom so that it's of optimal benefit to your students and your instructional practice?
Yeah, I think that happens when the testing is aligned with what you're teaching at that time. So in my mind, the most helpful tests are going to be the ones that are teacher generated, that really line up with what's being taught that week or in that unit. Those are the ones that we use to refine our instruction a lot. Some of my frustrations came when I was being given district mandated tests that were supposed to measure progress towards a standardized test, but actually didn't align with what was currently happening in the classroom. So the students felt like, this is not fair. We haven't been working on this yet. The teachers are feeling like, man, I can't get the success that my administrators want me to. Everybody feels demoralized rather than it being a picture of what we've actually been focusing on.
And I agree with her. We need more focusing on pre and post testing so we can really measure the growth of the student. We have a lot of students who are reading below grade level. In our district, 60% of our 3rd graders are reading below or at basic reading level. So we need to really focus in on pre and post assessments.
For our state test, results have a very long lag in reporting. So my 8th grade students who will be tested, I won't know the results of that test until the following year when those students are no longer sitting in my classroom. Furthermore, there's no reporting in my state on what standards were shown to be mastered and what weren't. You just get a raw score that says the student has passed or has not passed. And a useful assessment is one that indicates weaknesses and areas of strength and allows the teacher to respond to those and to celebrate things that students did well on, because even some of our lowest students have some strengths that we need to celebrate. So an effective test would indicate those things, and our current state test does not do that.
Joseph, do you have anything to add?
So actually, in contrast to Christina's experience, my district does provide periodic assessments that were that dealt with standards that hadn't been taught yet, but they were the same standards. Specifically, it was an ELA test. It was the same standards 3 times a year. And so it was a little bit stressful, and teachers, yes, had that. We haven't even taught that. But by the time you saw the data from the second assessment, you could see the growth and where you could focus. And then the third one was about a month before the actual state assessment. And so that had a high correlation to how your students would actually do on the end of the year assessment, which back then, because it wasn't something that was instant, we wouldn't find out the results till 3 months later. But I think it was very useful.
Great. So how are the new Common Core assessments different than the tests that you've been using? What do you see on the horizon? Why don't you start, Joseph, since you can speak to SBAC?
In California, we're part of the Smarter Balance Consortium. And so the things that teachers have been sort of wanting all along, not multiple choice tests that don't assess higher order thinking skills or critical thinking, but we want tests that assess those things and 21st century skills. So the big difference between SBAC, which is the Smartest Balance Test, and what we had previously, which was the California Standards Test, is that the assessment items are not all multiple choice. Students will have to write out their responses where they have to explain their thinking. They'll also have to provide and cite evidence from a text or a video. And these tests also are administered through a computer. They're computer adapted. So many of you might have, myself, I've taken the graduate record examination, which is GRE. It's computer adapted, so that's wonderful because that is specific to each individual student, and you get the feedback right at the end. So all of a sudden, what is usually just a summative assessment also turns into a formative assessment at the end of the year. So there's a big difference, and so I'm really excited.
Joy, what can you tell us about the PARCC assessments?
In the state of Tennessee, our schools are going to start piloting the PARCC test this spring to get ready for the implementation in the fall. And what we're noticing, it's going to be given twice a year, so in the fall and also in the spring. So it's like a pre and post measurement, which is totally different from the TCAP, which is given one time of year. So that's one positive thing. However, I want to also go back to the development levels of our students, making sure we get those basic skills for their students because these tests are higher, but we need to make sure they're ready for these type of tests.
And Christina and Joe, I know Indiana is sort of in a unique situation with the assessments. Do you have a sense of what the new Common Core tests are going to be like and how they'll be different?
Well, I think that's still up in the air right now. In some conversations with our state superintendent, I know what she said she would like to see would be tests that have kind of what Joseph was talking about with that adaptive element, where you could have a test bank that includes questions, from K to 12 and even college level questions. And wherever a student is at on the spectrum, they will be able to have questions at their level to get really specific information. Right now, I teach 10th grade English. So if I have a student reading at a 5th grade level, I'm just going to see, okay, they failed 10th grade skills across the board, but I have no idea what they can do, what their strengths are. If I have a student that's far above at the college level, I see, okay, they aced every 10th grade skill, but I actually don't have very specific information about them either. So I think we'd like to do something like that in Indiana where it is tailored and where we can really measure growth no matter where a student falls on the spectrum of ability.
So we talk a lot about test prep and test prep for students. What is test prep for teachers? Have you experienced this? For example, and I think you spoke a little bit to this, Joe, does your PD relate to testing? And if it is, does it help or should this be changed?
So an interesting thing that has happened, especially this year in my school, because we were recently rated as a failing school in the middle school level, based on state test results, is I've seen how testing can come to completely dominate a school culture. So all of our professional development this year essentially has been tailored to how we can raise our middle school test scores to fix that grade. So it dominates what happens in the school, and not only during professional development time, but we've tried to create after-school programs to help for test preparation and remediation and preparation for the state test. So in terms of preparing teachers, it's sort of the wrong way to do it. We should be preparing our teachers to be great instructors and to do a great job in the classroom. It shouldn't be a focus on, well, how can we make sure we're bubbling things in properly? How can we score points by making sure that students write something that's longer and not necessarily better? So we find all these workarounds that are like, to raise a student score from a 0 to a 1, we just need to get a kid to write anything instead of trying to move from a 3 to a 4. How do you make a kid an excellent writer? We're looking at how can we just make sure they score some more points so our grade goes up, and that's very unfortunate.
And do you think the focus on higher order skills with Common Core is going to help force those kinds of changes, or is that being too optimistic?
From what I understand of Common Core, it would be a much better system than what we have in place. If you are, in order to prepare students for Common Core, you're familiar with what the assessment items look like, and you know the level of thinking required to be successful. I found on our state test often we don't know what it looks like. It's sort of a mystery. We don't know what to look for. We get vague guidance on what will be on it. So in terms of preparing teachers, they need to know exactly what the test will look like and what level of thinking will be required to answer certain items, because right now we're just sort of guessing. So there's a lot of time and energy being invested in test strategies as opposed to actual quality instruction.
I would echo that. I feel like in Indiana, at least, we don't get a lot of very specific guidance on what the standards should look like in practice. Joe actually gave a great example earlier today about what 8th grade Pythagorean theorem looked like, and the way that he had interpreted it from reading the standard turned out to be totally different from the way that it was on the assessment. And I think that's something that happens a lot in our state because we don't have those clear examples like something like Smarter Balance or PARCC provides for teachers. So teachers don't even know what the goal is. They're just guessing and doing their best to prepare students for a mystery assessment. And then they don't trust that test because they feel like they can't win.
Joseph, I believe your title in your new job is Common Core Expert. Is that right?
Yeah, so I think,
Tell us what you think on
I
this.
think with the smaller, I just attended a training last week where we were actually looking at the different assessment types that make up the Smarter Balance. And so we were looking at how to even write these assessment items. So when I think about sort of test prep for teachers, first of all, I just want to say that it can and never will be a replacement for good first teaching. And then after an assessment, the reteaching that you do for the students that need that extra bit of support, or advancing the students that are already meeting the level of mastery that they already need to meet. So when I think about the 5 schools that I'm going to be working with and helping them to transition into the Common Core, one of the first trainings that we're going to provide as a team is looking at these assessment items and maybe in terms of the difficulty, the level of thinking, as Joe was mentioning. So there's the depth of knowledge, Webb's depth of knowledge, which is sort of like the Bloom's taxonomy, which is sort of the level of thinking that kids will be required to have in order to meet that standard. And so I'm looking forward to, looking at these assessment types, but also having teams of teachers actually write some and getting back to writing formative assessments, which is obviously going to be connected to the units of study that they're planning together. That's, so in terms of test prep, that's what I think about. We've got a clean slate.
So it sounds like there's some hope.
Yes.
Christina, something you mentioned earlier was the difference. It seems like testing is, sort of permeating the culture in all of your communities. But you mentioned the difference in testing culture when you taught in a school that was hitting it out of the park versus a school that was struggling. And so I'm also curious how you see the changes on the horizon in testing, maybe as do you see that as having the same reach into different kinds of schools, or do you still see the disparities?
I think it takes a shift from school leadership, to be honest. I think when you're in a school that is in a failing position, there is a sense of desperation. Like, you want to save your school and you want to, help the school move forward and make progress on the state ratings, which does create this urgency of, okay, we've got to do whatever it takes to move forward, even if that just means, we're doing the very basics to pass the test. So an example that we talked about is our essays on our English 10 end of course assessment get graded in about 20 seconds each. So we, if we tell the kids, you have to have 5 paragraphs, you have to have a good thesis, and you need some transitions with commas, you're probably going to pass the essay because they don't have time to really read it. So unless you have a school culture and school leadership that's saying, that's not the writing that we envision for our students, that requires more, I think it's really easy to just shoot for that minimum because that's what it takes at the state level to get that A rating. The school I'm at now, we do look at everything from the lens of what is the education we want our students to have, and the test is a measure of that. It's not the end goal of their education.
Great. So last question for me, Joy, I'm going to start with you on this one. What do you think students and parents should consider when they think about testing?
Well, going back to the main point is we need to meet children where they are. And a lot of our students are below, so testing is an opportunity to show a measurement. This is where I'm at the beginning of the year, and this is where I want to go towards the end of the year. So they need to feel good about themselves. So a lot of students are scared, and they have test anxiety, so it's our job to make them feel better and to tell them that they can succeed.
Joe?
So the way that testing currently works, it's in the culture I work in, is it's kind of dreaded. It's something we have to do, we're forced to do. And that's the same for administrators, teachers, and students and parents in the district. It's a negative thing. And I think that needs to change, because what testing is an opportunity to show what you know and to show what you don't know so you know what to work on. And something I've done in my own classroom is sort of change the thinking of my students when it comes to just tests or quizzes I give by not calling them tests or quizzes, but let's look at it as a measurement. Let's see what we know and what we don't and address it that way. And if testing, state testing could be viewed that way by parents and students, I think there'd be a lot more investment in the process. It's an opportunity to demonstrate what you know, but we also have to show that we're going to respond to what you don't know in order for it to be valuable. It has to be a tool of education, not the purpose of education.
Christina?
Yeah, I totally agree with what Joe's saying. I think that is contingent upon us having assessments that provide really specific breakdowns in their feedback rather than just a scale score that says you passed writing or you didn't. We need to know specifically what skills they excelled in and what skills they need more support on. I think when parents can see that, it creates a lot of buy-in.
Yeah, and it goes back to one of the things that was mentioned in the report about teachers. That assessment that is aligned with what they're doing in the classroom is the most important thing. And so, I mean, I want, as Joe was mentioning, I think assessments are just an opportunity for students to see where they're at and where they still need to go. And we all need that. So in life, there's always going to be that, where am I right now and how can I improve? And the end goal is for students to be college and career ready. So assessments that through K through 12 that allow teachers to use the data to help them continue to grow and continuously improve, I think that's the most important thing.
Great, thank you all. Do we have questions? Yes.
Myrna Manslowitz. I represent a number of groups, including the Learning Disabilities Association. I know, Joseph, you spoke a bit about English language learners. We're very concerned and have had many conversations with PARCC and Smarter Balanced about accommodations provided or not to be provided for kids with disabilities. And I think if the purpose of the test is to ensure that we, as some of you have stated, have good instruction and whatever, I'd just like some comments about how we're going to assess students with learning disabilities and other disabilities and make it fair and useful.
I think portfolio-based assessments is a good tool. In Tennessee, our fine arts departments have a portfolio measurement for the teachers. So they take quantitative and qualitative data from the beginning of the year and towards the end of the year. So you can see the growth of the students. So I think taking a portfolio measurement would be a good piece.
I guess I'm asking more about on these standardized assessments. That's not going to be a portfolio, and those students are going to be tested and are being tested in the same way. So what can we do to ensure that they put their best foot forward?
I would imagine that there's going to be a lot of the same accommodations that at least we have currently in Indiana. We don't have Smarter Balance, so I can't speak to that. But things like extended time, like having a scribe to write your response for you, using a computer if that's, if it's a handwritten test, having somebody read questions that are not reading comprehension.
And then also in my district is in the process of buying a lot of iPads, sort of controversial, and then laptops. We're exploring that, trying to figure out. I have a friend who's in special education. He's actually a Teach Plus Policy Fellow in LA, and he uses the iPads all the time with a lot of success. He's a special ed teacher in middle school. And so providing access equitably to those students as well and making sure they have an opportunity to become familiar and use and practice testing in that environment, I think is important.
Yes.
Your thoughts about states that are moving away from PARCC and Smarter Balance, that are now considering developing their own tests. Any thoughts about that? Whether that's going to throw a wrench into the works, or the view that we should all be using at least the same assessments, so that for comparability reasons and for all kinds of other reasons, is it a good idea for tests to just strike out on their own and develop their own tests?
In the state of Indiana, we had initially adopted the Common Core state standards. They're called the Indiana Common Core state standards, and many of our school districts around the state were proceeding with implementation, and then our state legislature decided to halt that implementation because because we wanted to, at the state level, wanted to make our own college and career ready standards, which is a requirement. And I don't think it's a good idea personally. I think the Common Core state standards are the result of a tremendous amount of work and would really elevate instruction, which is their best feature, is that if you're going to prepare students for the tests based on the Common Core state standards, it has to actually improve what happens in the classroom, which is not currently the case in Indiana. And I'm not confident that we could do that in the state of Indiana on our own, develop the type of standards that have been shown to improve instruction. So I think it's very important to have a common measuring stick from state to state, and I regret that we're not proceeding with that fully in Indiana.
How about California?
Well, I think that I agree with Joe. I think that would be a big mistake. I think the thing is that the reason the Common Core was developed in the first place was because a student who left California to go to another state, might have the state that they're at, they could be proficient in that state, where in California they weren't quite proficient. They weren't meeting the benchmarks that were set. And the thing is that the smarter balance assessment that we're piloting this year, and it's going to be in effect next year, really does capture sort of the instructional shifts and the work that was done among a large group of people. And it wasn't the federal government, it was academics. These were benchmarked against Singapore standards and Hong Kong standards. I think it would be a huge mistake, because I don't think it will lead kids to being college and career ready. That's the whole point. These were backwards mapped from what the expectations were from professors in ELA and math, so that we don't have to do remediation.
I think that our standards are only as good as our assessment. Currently, Indiana's standards prior to the Common Core were rated very highly in terms of their rigor, but as I kind of spoke to our English language arts assessment, I don't think it's very rigorous at all. So for us to truly implement college and career ready standards, we have to have an assessment that is benchmarked at that level that Joseph's talking about.
Alex, did you have a question or comment?
Yeah, I'm Alex Fuentes, and I just wanted to talk about, respond to the question about students with special needs and also the Common Core. Not necessarily should we all use the same assessment, but the real opportunity that the Common Core presents in the classroom, and it's changing the way that teachers are talking about instruction. And I think it's going to change the way that we're doing instruction in the classroom to help students who have special needs to really improve all learning. If we just take DC as a case study, right, the current DC CAS state assessment is written at an 8th grade reading level. And if we have half of students not proficient on that, that means half our students aren't in 10th grade reading at an 8th grade level, right? It's a tragedy, but what Common Core does is it says that ELA teachers are not the only ones who use reading and writing in our instruction. And it says, as a science teacher in my biology classroom, I have clear standards for how to get students to read more analytically and write more thoughtfully. And those kinds of changes are happening in the way teachers talk. And teachers, even in DC, through Teach Plus, are getting together and talking about, okay, how do we actually change our instruction in a science and a history and a math class so students can learn how to read? And so we need to stick with those assessments, because it's a huge shift in what we're doing in the classroom, and it's going to make a huge difference in how our students learn.
Yes.
My name is Ellen Street, and I'm a student at the University of Missouri for TESOL. And I was curious if you guys had any implications that this might have on bilingual learners as they're trying to assimilate into the American society.
So one of the interesting things that Joseph brought up was the additional testing required of English language learners. I mean, so if we look at the time on testing, you can take that and increase it by varying amounts across districts, but increase it for English language learners because they're constantly being benchmarked on their English language skills. So there's a very interesting conversation to be had, I suppose, around, are those assessments effective? Are they measuring English language acquisition well? Are they helping ELA teachers or classroom teachers realize the weaknesses of their English language learning students and in a way that they can address those? So the time on testing is obviously increased for those students. Are those tests working? And I think it's a very important question to ask.
And I think the assessments raise, because they're aligned with the Common Core, they're at the level, they're raising the bar, not just for other students, but for English language learners as well. So literacy is very important. So the foundational skills piece of the Common Core is very strong. So that's the sort of the foundation for English language learners, because if they don't have the literacy skills, and also in terms of oral language development, the speaking and listening standards, there's some smarter balanced assessment items where they're given a task and they actually have to go talk in a small group, and then they go back to writing. So that kind of building of communication skills and collaboration skills, that's solid in the Common Core, and that's assessed on some items. And then for math, there's the mathematical practices. So mathematical practice number 3 talks about critiquing others' reasoning. So not just occurring in ELA, but like in math and science, talk is very important. So that oral language development will help English language learners to progress farther along, and it will improve their writing skills as well.
Wait, did you have a question or comment? And please introduce yourself.
Dwight Davis. I'm also a Teach Plus DC alum. But my question had to do with technological literacy and the PARCC and Smarter Balance. They're going to be online. And so how is that going to impact your ability to prepare students for this assessment? Is that going to demand even more time? What other literacies are necessary? Can you just speak on that?
Well, we're starting our writing test now in the state of Tennessee, and we have time where we're teaching keyboarding skills in the library time, and also telling our parents, you need to also help in preparing our students for the new PARCC, the new Common Core. So it takes everyone, not just the teacher. It takes the community, the parents, the students, and the teacher.
I'm really glad that you asked that question, because I think that maybe that speaks to some of why urban students do spend more time on test prep, is that technological literacy is often not part of our curriculum. But when I hear people raising concerns about, we're going to need to have more computers in our school, we're going to need to teach our students how to type for these upcoming assessments, that's kind of horrifying that it takes a test for us to say that we need computers and to teach students to type in the year 2014. I mean, if that's what it takes to get computers in our school, then I guess I'm glad that we have them.
Anyone else want to chime in on that?
I mean, I think the technology constraints, the school I work in, we're very limited in our resources in terms of computer availability. So in preparing for the test and taking diagnostic tests and all the other time we spend in getting ready for the state test, that's one of the things that has to be managed, is that capacity, that technology or lack of capacity. So we have, it's a very difficult thing to do when you have 3 computer labs for hundreds of students and you only have, less than 100 computers. So it's a challenge, certainly. And just sort of another facet of the test that is questionable.
And I would just say in brief that technology skills and integration can't be an afterthought. It has to be integrated within units of study so that students are actually using it as a tool for their learning. If not, I mean, I'm not even thinking about the PARCC, but that's the skills that are necessary for students in the 21st century.
Are there any questions from Twitter that we want to ask? Not yet? Okay. Other questions? Yes.
If I may, for all the good things that PARCC and Common Core and Smarter Balance may bring to the table for reform, I want to know whether, the real controversy out there is how the test scores are going to be used, how the results are going to be used. And one of those is in evaluating teachers. Any thoughts about how test scores moving forward are going to help evaluate the work you do in the classroom?
That's why I feel you have to have a balance of assessments. You need to have qualitative and quantitative data. You need to have pre and post tests so you can have a measurement of growth and not just a test where you give it to them once a year. So every teacher should have their own growth measurement. You need to know if you're helping your students grow within that year, but it has to be balanced.
I think part of the animosity towards the state test Indiana is that it is part of our evaluation by state law. So teachers are scared of the test, and that sort of contributes to the very negative culture around the test, is that teachers know that it will have a direct impact on their evaluation, their job, and there's a lot of concern among my colleagues about the test for that reason, especially since the test is very mysterious. And so teachers don't feel like they can know what level their students need to reach to be successful. So that's part of the negative culture of testing that's been created. I don't think that means that testing should not be part of evaluation. I think it absolutely should, but I think it has to be effective testing and testing that teachers believe in. So one of the recommendations from the report was to involve teachers in the selection of the tests, and I think that would be a very valuable way to create that investment on behalf of teachers and take it from a very negative thing to something that could be positive. It would allow teachers to show what they do every day, kind of a result to point to and say, this is what I accomplished, but that's not the current case in Indiana.
I think it helps, with it being an indicator of teacher effectiveness and part of teacher evaluation, that I think there should be a sort of a period, and I think it should be part of evaluation, but I think there should be a period of transitioning into this and doing it well with teachers at the table, as Joe was mentioning. I think accountability just for accountability's sake is a wrong policy driver. I think this is an opportunity to build up shared collective professional knowledge together. So if there's space to do that, I think there won't be the negative sort of atmosphere around testing and sort of fear. I don't want fear or compliance. I want people to be motivated, and testing's part of that. I want them to be motivated to improve their practice, not just individually, but as a group, because that's where I think we really get sort of the reform and the effects on student achievement that are sustainable.
Tina, do you have thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think it's a quality issue. I'm really glad that we have things like assessment advisor and just conversations starting around the quality of assessments. An example I'll give from Indiana is we might get an item sample from our test, and there's 4 or 5 English teachers sitting around a room. We all have master's degrees, highly educated, feel pretty confident that we should be able to pass a 10th grade English test, and we'll come up with 3 different valid answers on this multiple choice question, and we can all give, text-based reasons why we chose that answer. So do I want to be evaluated on the results of that question? No, I don't. That doesn't seem fair. Do I want to be evaluated on a test that doesn't measure growth? Well, if I teach in an inner city school where I'm, bringing kids from well below grade level to still below grade level, but maybe 3 grade levels higher, I would like to have credit for that. And if the current tests don't do that, teachers are not going to trust them and they're not going to be invested in that system.
Dwight, do you have comments on that as a teacher in DCPS who has lived under impact for a few years, one of the pioneering districts? I would love for you to have an opportunity to chime in if you'd like to.
Sure. So I recently had the opportunity to publish a piece in Learning from the Experts. It's a great book. I think everybody should get a copy of it. And so I talked about impact in teaching evaluation. And I really feel like impact is a good thing, because when you look at teacher evaluation before impact, it was very inconsistent. You really didn't know when you were going to be evaluated. You didn't know there was no criteria that was given to you firsthand to say, hey, this is what you're going to be evaluated on. And so what impact does is it clearly says to teachers, here are the standards that you're going to be evaluated on. Here's what is expected. Here's an exemplar example. Here is a terrible example of teaching. There are videos that you can access, right? And I do think that it has definitely helped my teaching practice, because we have a common language that we can use. So if my principal comes in, he's talking about one particular standard, and my assistant principal comes in, or an independent evaluator comes in, we are all speaking the same language. The difficulty is, and I think the panel discussed this earlier, was that when we take these summative assessments, the data that comes back is not as specific as it needs to be to help me help students grow more. So, for example, when we take the DC CAS, there are generalities. Here's how a child did in informational texts. Here's how a child did in literary text. Here's how a child did in vocabulary. But what I need to know at the beginning of the school year is when we look at standard L54, how did he or she do? Because that will let me know how to better personalize this child's educational experience. And so if the assessments are going to give me more meaningful data, I'm all for it. But if it's just going to speak in generalities, that's not helpful because it takes me at least 2 to 3 months to really figure out, oh, this is the issue that the child has. Right? So I think, impact, I think it's an imperfect, perfect system. And I give DCPS a tremendous amount of credit because each year there's been a new iteration, things change. Initially it was 50% of your evaluation is solely based on students' test scores. Now it's 35% and 15%. You and your principal decide, what your growth measure is going to be. So I think the system is iterating and changing. But I think it's good, but I think you must always have that flexibility built in. Yeah.
I saw some nodding heads up here. We're about at time. Is there a last question, or I want to also give you guys give you a chance for any last parting thoughts?
It was just an additional thought. I'm also a DCPS teacher. I've worked in DCPS as both a teacher and an instructional coach. And being a person whose job it is to be a professional development, to provide professional development in the area of the Common Core has been somewhat of a struggle. And I think back to the question around how we are evaluated, one of the struggles that we have as teachers is also, does an assessment have a growth portion? Like, I'm teaching 5th grade right now, sharing with Dwight. I've moved most of my class about a year, but also of that class, the majority of them are reading below grade level. So are they going to access the assessment? So do the assessments we have measure both standards, grade level standard expectations and growth measures to get a picture of a teacher? I could have a class that came to me 4 years behind. I could grow them to just right where they need to be, and then they all bomb the assessment that's based on their grade level expectations. So then I therefore look like I'm not an effective teacher, but I closed their entire elementary gap by myself. Do you know what I mean? Those kinds of considerations. And I don't think that is just an urban school issue. I think that's a national issue. And then the bigger issue is why do we have children getting to these levels of 3rd, 4th, 5th, 6th grade so far behind? So what value do we put on early childhood education is a whole nother layer. And why isn't that evaluated, or aren't teachers made aware of student growth and readiness when they enter school in the first place?
So are you worried that the Common Core tests that are aligned with Common Core are not going to value you or evaluate you appropriately because you move these kids forward?
No.
You're not?
No. I'm not worried about implementing the standards. They have raised the quality of my teaching practice. What I'm concerned about is that when there's only one measure, and that measure doesn't give you an entire picture of instruction or growth of students, then that's put us actually in a nation in a very dire place.
And I agree. And the point is, literacy in America is totally going down. And we have teachers who are pre-K through 2nd grade teachers. Phonemic awareness, you really do not have time to teach those early skills because we have going to the computer to do intervention, and we need the face one-on-one time. So having a portfolio like our state has for fine arts, you have qualitative and quantitative data so you can get that credit for growing your students. So literacy is key, and we need to have more information and more dialogue on literacy in America.
Any last thoughts? And then we're going to shift to panel 2.
I just think a very, very big consideration is not necessarily the time on testing. It varies widely across the country, as this report shows, and more testing does not necessarily equal better results. So what we really need to consider is, are our tests improving our schools? Are the tests creating conversations among teachers that are elevating instruction? Are the tests doing what they need to do to make sure student learning is what it needs to be and should be? That's the biggest question we have to ask when looking at assessment.
Very wise last words. Thank you, Joe, and thank you all. Please join me in thanking you.